Okay, I am Kyle Shelton, and I am the lawyer, and this is.
The doctor and the lawyer. I'm Dr. Shah. I'm a board certified internist. I am on the front lines of the current pandemic that we are all living through really as citizens of the world. And we've decided, the lawyer and I, that lawyer being Kyle Shelton, that we needed to take some of the conversations that he and I have been having in response to this exigent threat and at least share it with other folks that might be interested in some of what my 25 years of experience as a medical doctor that's been treating upper respiratory infections, that has treated a variety of other infectious agents. If we could bring some of that experience and share it with some of our viewers. That's kind of our intention and our purpose. I want to be clear about something. A lot of folks in modern American medicine are really addicted to and dependent on evidence-based medicine. And I too rely upon evidence-based medicine to make clinical decisions. You typically think of evidence-based medicine when you think of like, oh, it's a double-blinded, placebo-controlled study, and the results of the study were significant enough to justify a change in the way that we treat someone. And that's all good and well, but evidence-based medicine is entirely retrospective. It is not prospective. We cannot have evidence-based medicine to rely upon when we're facing something new. And this is an entirely novel problem. The coronavirus responsible for COVID-19 has never been experienced by anybody in humanity until quite recently. It's the reason why it is so highly infectious, because there is no herd immunity. There aren't a large number of folks in the world who already have immunity to it. And so we're all vulnerable to it. And it's a time where our conventional ways of treating patients based upon evidence-based medicine is going to be challenged, and I think arguably is going to break. We're going to have to rely on the experience of people, of medical doctors who have been treating conditions similar to this for many, many years, and who also have a solid foundational grasp of microbiology, of immunology, of infectious diseases, and epidemiology. So that's kind of the background from which I think this dialogue and this conversation is sprouting.
And I know you and I think, have spoken at length, effectively daily, since this crisis hit our shores, about what's happening to America, what's happening to the state of healthcare in America, and really often common sense approaches to how regular people like myself who don't have any kind of medical training, are able to cope with what is an unprecedented amount of uncertainty, fear, anxiety, and really panic about how you and your loved ones can survive what we're going through, something that nobody really alive today has experienced. So I think, well, go ahead.
Well, Kyle, I'm going to give you and our viewers 5 commonsensical things that they can do to combat COVID-19. And I want to state that we're going to offer these 5 common sense recommendations in the background of the fact that there are people on the internets that are actually advocating that people use hot air blowers to blow air down their airway to try to kill the virus. I can tell you categorically that is a horrible idea, because sending that temperature of air down into your upper airway could cause the damage that would actually predispose you to infection with the virus responsible for COVID-19. And I've also heard people say drinking hot liquids is a good idea. It's not. Even drinking hot liquids in and of themselves may or may not, in my opinion, make any difference. So there's a lot of information that's being propagated. I just had a Facebook friend from high school who sent me an audio recording that she'd gotten from someone that had a whole bunch of crazy recommendations on how to reduce your likelihood of contracting the coronavirus responsible for COVID-19. So I'm a board certified internist. I've been treating upper respiratory tract infections for 25 years. And I'm going to lay out for us 5 common sense, basic things. I don't know about common sense, but they're the fruits of my experience that I think make sense in the age that we are living in under the pandemic. So the first one is the use of a cool mist humidifier. I recommend that every American have one by their bedside, blowing an arc of mist so that the air that they breathe is saturated with humidity. And why do I say that? Because dry mucous membranes are far more vulnerable to penetration by both bacteria and virus than moist mucous membranes. Now, I'm going to use a very technical term here, Kyle, and that term is a booger.
Okay.
Okay. Now, we know that we don't have mouth boogers, but we definitely have these little bundles of secretions that form what are commonly referred to as a booger in our nose. So what's the reason for that? Well, that is the mucus that lines our upper airway, particularly our nose, that allows us to trap a virus, trap a bacteria, wrap it up inside of those secretions, and then the next time that we blow our nose, the next time that we sneeze, the next time that we do any kind of nasal hygiene, out goes the virus, out goes the bacteria. I have been such a proponent of using the cool mist humidifier to treat the influenza season and the common cold that I had patients from a previous life when I was on the East Coast refer to me as Dr. Cool Mist Humidifier.
Why cool mist? Why not a hot mist humidifier? Because I know I have both at home.
That's a great question and a great a point of clarity. Warm mist tends to grow mold, whereas a cool mist does not. And so that's why I've always been an advocate of the cool mist humidifier. So moisturizing our airway, giving our airways, our upper airways, a fighting chance to catch the virus, envelop it in secretions, and then be able to expel it is one of the more common sense basic things that we can do. Now, keep in mind that while the coronavirus responsible for COVID-19 can be transmitted in at least 3 ways that we've identified. It can be transmitted through direct contact. That means that someone touches a doorknob with hands that have the virus on it, and then you touch that, and then you touch your eyes, you touch your nose, or you touch your mouth, and that causes the transmission. Or you have a direct handshake with someone who's got the virus on their hands, and that you get it that way. That is one mode of transmission. There's a second mode that we've identified, which is enteric, vis-a-vis the gut, which is why, as the number of patients with COVID-19 are becoming apparent, especially for some reason out of China, a lot of them experience diarrhea. So we know that there are GI manifestations of COVID-19 and that enteric transmission, enteric just means vis-a-vis the gut. And when I speak to the gut, I'm talking about everything from the mouth all the way to the anus. But that if you have the virus, that it can be transmitted that way.
Well, just to ask a question on that, I've heard, or at least there seems to be some rumors or rumblings that it could be fecally transmitted. And I think for people who have young children, and I've heard even rumors that with young children, that might be one of the primary ways in which it is transmitted through them. Is that what you're hearing, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think oral fecal, a lot of people are disgusted by the idea of oral fecal transmission, but I can tell you as a medical doctor, it's one of the more common ways that pathogens are passed on from one human being to another. And the way that it happens is not literally that you're ingesting somebody else's feces, but that trace amounts of those feces end up on the hands of service providers, food prep, other ways that there are contamination of sources that then end up causing trace amounts of the feces of an infected individual to end up in your mouth, and from there it goes on to cause enteric transmission. So that's clearly one way, okay? But I suspect there's a second way as well. And again, a lot of this is speculative because it's just so new. We don't know. There are so many twists and turns that we can get into about COVID-19 that make it, still very enigmatic. But I would suggest that one of the ways that it's ending up in the gut of human beings is that it initially lodges in the upper airway, for example, in the nose, and then from there, we know that it's doing something very interesting. So this is an important part of the pathophysiology of COVID-19 that we have to understand. is that to the extent that we understand it now, here's what happens. One way or another, the coronavirus ends up in our upper airway. Think of that really just as the nose, okay? And there it locks on, attaches, and it begins to multiply. And once it multiplies, it does something very interesting and very clever. It turns on channels, likely sodium channels, other electrolyte channels, that cause a profuse amount of secretions to develop. But those secretions run down the back of your throat. So it's basically postnasal drip on steroids. Now, many patients who have come down with this infection will describe it as they were literally drowning in their secretions. So these secretions, when swallowed, end up in the stomach, and I think that's another way to get enteric transmission. So it's airway, upper airway, to the gut, vis-a-vis swallowing it, but that's not what the virus is interested in. The virus is interested in us swallowing secretions, but ultimately aspirating them. Now, let's be clear on what aspiration is. Aspiration is the introduction of either oral secretions or food particles into the trachea and vis-a-vis the trachea into the lungs. This is the underpinning of the bad COVID-19 infection. We know there's some individuals that just have cold or flu-like symptoms, some patients that don't even have hardly any symptoms at all. They merely recover with a full immune response. But those that become intubated, ventilated, and are now facing near death or actual death, those are the patients in which secretions have to be aspirated and they have to get down into the lower lungs. And from there, the multiplication of that causes a bunch of different things, including an excessive response from the immune system. One of those ways we describe it as a cytokine storm. That's where some of the cytokines or agents that we use to modulate the immune system kind of go into overdrive. And that causes a lot of collateral damage in the lungs. And that's what actually ends up causing something called ARDS, adult respiratory distress syndrome. And that is what ultimately kills the patient.
Well, I have a question for you, which is that you have one of the first symptoms people state about getting COVID-19 is a dry cough. And yet at the same time, as a layperson, I'm reading quite a bit of literature that says once, exactly as you just described, once it gets into your lungs, you start aspirating it into your lungs, that's when it finds the playground in which it becomes more deadly. What is this dry cough coming from then? Is that if one of your first symptoms is dry cough, does that mean it's in your lungs during the dry cough or no?
No. In fact, if you look at, so there's two types of coughs. There's the cough that comes from deep within the lungs. And if you ever see somebody coughing that way, I'm going to just demonstrate it for you, okay?
Okay.
I've done this over the years for patients, and I might as well do it for our viewers today. So when a cough emanates from the lungs itself, it tends to be one, productive, and two, it tends to be like this. That's a lung cough. There's another kind of cough that's triggered by postnasal drip. That's where the cough reflex is engaged, but there's actually no production. It's dry. That cough goes like this. It's bothersome. It can make people get exhausted. They can't sleep because a lot of times postnasal drip worsens when they're recumbent. But that kind of cough is oftentimes confused with, oh, I must have a lung problem. And I've even had medical students and even residents make that mistake. And it comes, I guess, with some experience. But that cough is actually not due to a lung problem initially. It's actually due to an upper airway problem. And from that, it causes that dry cough, which takes us back to the cool mist humidifier. Because one of the problems is that postnasal drip is accentuated with dry mucous membranes. So having a humid environment reduces postnasal drip. Now, let's get to the second common sense. Remember, I promised you 5. I may even make it 6. I'm not sure yet, but for the time being, I'll leave it at 5. Good recommendations to help us combat respiratory viruses like the one responsible for COVID-19. The second thing I recommend is that every morning, take a long, hot, steamy shower. Now, I want to be clear about something. This is not to kill the virus. The heat in your shower will not do that. Do not let scalding hot water go into your mouth or into your nose, none of that. However, remain in that shower so that the steam enters your nasal passages, that the steam is what you're inhaling. Why is that sensible? Because it will help you to expectorate. One of the things that each of us should be doing every morning in the shower is blowing out each air. Take a little bit of water, not hot, not anything that could inflict damage, but take a little bit of water and inhale it, just not a deep inhalation, but just enough to get it into the nasal passage, and then holding the other one closed, blow that out. So you want to have a mechanical process whereby the night secretions are all expelled from your body. A hot, steamy shower will do that. Now, I'm going to move on to the third recommendation that I want to make to help us combat upper respiratory viruses like COVID-19. And that is, don't take antihistamines to treat it. And why do I say that? Well, it sounds counterintuitive because antihistamines dry you up a little bit and can slow down your secretions. And isn't that what we want if you have COVID-19? It is what we want. But what we don't want are the sedating effects of antihistamines. And why do I now want you to be sedated even a little bit? Because the more sedated you are while you're asleep, the more likely you are to aspirate. And aspiration is how this virus does its deadly damage. It gets into your lungs through aspiration. Now, I do want to make one caveat. There are individuals, unfortunate individuals, who happen to be literally in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they inhale directly into their lungs a bolus of virus from a third party, from another person. Those individuals bypass the upper airway, they bypass the nose, they bypass that period where it has to multiply and open up channels that'll trigger a bunch of secretions to form, and they just get it straight into the lungs. So I do recognize that some people get inoculated with it directly into the lungs, and they don't do well. So I'm excluding that group. It's, I think, a minority of the patients that end up with pneumonia from COVID-19, but there is that subset as well. I'm not addressing them with these recommendations. And by the way, again, these are recommendations that are the result of my empiric experience. We've already talked about the fact that we don't have evidence-based stuff to rely upon because this darn virus is too new. So we can't rely on a textbook or even an article that'll give us guidelines on what are the safeguards that we can use. And I'm hoping to put some sensible doctor-recommended modalities that'll help. So antihistamines and other sedatives that might be utilized to help treat an upper respiratory tract infection, in my opinion, are not a good idea because of their sedating effects and because sedation results in potential for aspiration. Does that make sense, Kyle?
It does. I've also heard something about not taking ibuprofen. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, ibuprofen is somewhat controversial. I think for patients that need it to be functional, the recommendations by all of the medical societies are that they're to continue taking it.
Okay.
So I don't think that I'm going to include that. That will not be my sixth recommendation today. My fourth recommendation, however, is that if you develop a significant upper respiratory tract infection, and because of the difficulties that we currently have in testing, because the guidelines are fairly stringent, without a fever, you're not probably going to be tested at any of the sites that are available. This has been a frustrating part. I mean, we could do a whole vlog on just some of the challenges that we've faced as a nation in how to properly contain this, just from a technical point of view. But we'll save that for another day. But if you're not going to be tested, or you can't be tested, or you don't meet the criteria, but you're producing a lot of secretions, I would urge you, for the time that you're under the weather, that you sleep in a recliner. and that your body be at least no greater than 45 degrees of recumbency. Why do I recommend that? Because being at 45 degrees of recumbency or less allows the secretions to go where they belong. Remember, this virus makes a lot of secretions, and it's doing it by design to try to get you to be overwhelmed by the secretions, and so that in deep sleep, while you are recumbent, while you are horizontally laid out, that some of those secretions that contain the actively replicating virus ends up going down the proverbial wrong tube and ends up in the lungs causing an infection. So a recliner is a good idea. If you have a lot of post-nasal drip and you're actively suffering from an undiagnosed upper respiratory tract infection. Now, the fifth recommendation that I make involves a terminology that I'll introduce to our audience called the marginal pool. Now, we all have an immune system. Those of us that are healthy and blessed, we have a functioning immune system. And our immune system is that man on the wall that stands ready and able to protect us. And it comes in a variety of ways. There are antibodies that make up part of our immune system, and then there are white cells. There are leukocytes and there are lymphocytes, and they all work in coordination to combat any potential threat that our human body may experience. Now, think of our immune system as having two different parts. There's the part that is in our bloodstream, and I call that our active duty personnel. These are the policemen. These are the other high-risk parts of our immune system that are readily available to us. They're there, ready, willing, and able. And we all, if we have a functioning immune system, if we are, as the term goes, immunocompetent, we certainly have those at our disposal. But we have a marginal pool. The marginal pool are an army of cells, immune cells, that are basically on hiatus. They're like the National Guard or the Reserve. They remain in our lymphatics, and they're there when and if we need them in the event of an overwhelming infection. Now, my advice to my patients is, don't wait for the overwhelming infection in order to invoke the, hey, marginal pool, we've got to get you on active duty. You want to do that before the storm. And the way that you do that is by exercise. So brisk, vigorous exercise, whether it's aerobic or whether you're building muscles by lifting. And I know, Kyle, that you're a big fan of weightlifting, which I think is wonderful, because that contraction and relaxation of big muscles, whether it's the upper extremity, the lower extremity, the chest muscles, all of these muscles basically invigorate the marginal pool, and literally, this is almost too literal, but it's actually the way it works. It squeezes them out of the lymphatics and into your blood supply. And you want to be walking around every day while we're living in the age of a pandemic with your immune system looking more like Arnold Schwarzenegger rather than the guy that never worked out.
Now, there's some folks I've read that those who are professional athletes, marathon runners, people who are involved in a high intensity training, we're talking about hours and hours a day. I mean, almost, like a Michael Phelps during his prime figure, who during this crisis is still going out and hitting the pool and running around the track. I've heard that those folks can almost in some ways push what you're saying, this response maybe to a fatiguing level. Does that make sense? Have you heard that sometimes these extreme athletes, those who are, putting their body through that great stress, maybe are leaving themselves a little immunocompromised, and that's why sometimes you see in these epidemics like flus and various things, individuals who you'd think are a prime example of health and fitness who seem to be taken down faster than your normal individual. Is that a concern for you for some of these folks? Or should you ever find a...
It's not a realistic concern, because rarely am I addressing world-class athletes. But I will tell you this: the immune system is subject to stress. That stress comes at it from a variety of ways: malnutrition, lack of sleep, psychological and emotional stress will actually impair your immune system.
So basically, all of us right now have an impaired
All of
immune
us right now are walking wounded because of the global emotional trauma that we're experiencing. Believe it or not, alterations in our gut flora, because our immune system thrives when our gut bacteria thrive. And you know, Kyle, that prior to this pandemic, my big interest in organisms didn't have to do with virus, it had to do with bacteria, specifically the gut bacteria, which is why on Instagram I run the Gutsy MD page in an effort to try to educate folks about the benefits of keeping your gut microbiota, that's the trillions of organisms that live in our gut, keeping them varied and keeping them healthy. But it is a perfect segue here, because that's, if you have altered gut microbiota, if you have what we call gut dysbiosis, that is another way that your immune system is not operating at optimal capacity. Now, one of the reasons why certain comorbidities like diabetes have been mentioned over and over again is because they can impact your immune function as well. They can leave you functionally immunocompromised. And that's why diabetics tend to do not as well as non-diabetics when facing infectious agents. All right, now, I want to summarize the 5 recommendations that I've made, and then we can wrap this one up, and maybe we can do another one, because I like the flow that we've got going on here. But cool mist humidifier, using that on a nightly basis, a steamy hot shower every morning, not to in any way harm your upper airway with hot water, but to let that steam help you evacuate whatever secretions have accumulated overnight. Avoiding the use of sedatives that could trigger more aspiration risk, like antihistamines. Using a recliner if you have an undiagnosed upper respiratory condition that is causing significant postnasal drip. And finally, regular exercise, and using that as the method by which you're invoking the marginal pool, that's your army reserve in your immune system, and getting them out on the front lines to give you the best possible chance of fighting off any infection, including a brand new novel one like the coronavirus.
Should this be a time, a lot of us now, I currently am home. A lot of us are working from home or staying at home based on recommendations, and you can see on social media, and you can see through all of our friends and family out there, some people are taking this as a time to sit on the couch, watch Netflix, order a pizza, eat some junk food, and relax. And I'm not judging that. I think that's a coping mechanism for what is the stress and anxiety we're all feeling right now. And others, and I'm trying to put myself in this group, are trying to eat healthier, get more sleep, exercise as you can, go on long walks, in preparation for what may be all of us, potentially, all of us are at risk to getting this virus at some point. Is this an opportunity for people to take some self-care and to try to get themselves to a baseline of health to help fight this virus should they eventually come into contact with it?
It's absolutely the latter. This is an opportunity for self-care on every level, spiritual, psychological, and physical. This is a time to be contemplative. This is a time to realize, in many ways, just how powerless we are in the grand scheme of things. We're dealing now with an adversary that's invisible, that is not going to respond to nuclear threats, that is not going to respond to Apache gunships or drones. This is an enemy like none that we've seen in our lifetime, and it poses an exigent threat. But we are Americans, we are resilient, we are a nation that is built on ingenuity. The last time that we as Americans faced an exigent threat of this magnitude, I have to go all the way back to World War II. And at that time, it was basically the axis of evil, principally led by the Third Reich, by the Nazis of Germany. But the reality was that all of Europe was starting to lose hope in their ability to combat that threat to their way of life, to the world as we knew it. And then Americans rolled up their sleeves and they said, not so fast. We're here. We're going to take a stand for what is right. And we are a people that are industrious and ingenious. And that is why Tom Brokaw coined it, but we all embrace the term, the greatest generation. That's why we give them that title. Now it is our time, and it is our time to be our best selves, to be our best version of who we are as Americans. And that is going to require a level of fortitude that many of us may not have ever had to turn to. I can tell you as a doctor, that I've practiced for 25 years without ever really being afraid for the safety of my family or my personal safety as a result of what I do. I live with that exigent threat now every day. And I reconciled myself with it. Why? Because we are Americans and that's how we have to do.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. I think hopefully people will walk away with some concrete tips and recommendations. I know that in a situation where a lot of us do feel powerless, a lot of us do feel that there's nothing we can do, it's good to have some actual tangible things that we can do, not only to get ourselves healthy enough to potentially fight this if we were to get it, but also, should we get it, some actual concrete tips that we can do to minimize the risk that a lot of us are very fearful of, no matter what your age or preconditions are.
Well,
So,
I hope those 5 recommendations help.
all right. Thank you very much, and we will see you on the next episode.